Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, November the 17th. It's our third lesson in our unit of study entitled Struggles of Faith. This week our lesson is entitled God Was with Joseph. Our focal scriptures in the 39th chapter of Genesis. Last week we studied about Jacob and how he went to Haran to escape Esau and also to find a wife. And we studied about his time there. And in the 35th chapter of Genesis, it lists the sons of Jacob. There were 12 sons by 4 different women. The sons of Jacob were 12, Genesis 35 tells us. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Padan Aram. Genesis 37 through 50, the last 14 chapters in Genesis, tell the story of Jacob's sons who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. But in those 14 chapters, the focus is primarily on one son in particular, and that's Joseph. With favoritism rearing its head and in the family, Jacob favored Joseph more than his other sons and more than his elder brothers because he was the son of the favorite wife, Rachel. He was also born in Jacob's old age. And so today we're going to see the results of that favoritism in Joseph's life. Chapter 37 tells us that Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. And tells us that when Joseph was 17 years of age, he was tending sheep with his 4 brothers who were the daughters of those handmaids, and he brought a bad report to Jacob, their father. And obviously that wouldn't endear him to those sons. And Jacob already favored Joseph. And then he made him a special coat, a long-sleeved robe. And so that further alienated his brothers. And then Joseph had a dream. And the dream suggested that his brothers would one day bow down to him and serve him. And that dream was repeated. This time the sun, moon, and stars were bowing down to me. And so he told his brothers these dreams. He told his father these dreams, and his father rebuked him. "What kind of dream is this you've had?" he said. "Am I and your mother and your brothers really going to come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him. And so that's kind of the family dynamic. Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers. They were tending the flocks at Shechem. And when the brothers saw him coming, they decided to get rid of him. They were going to kill him. Reuben, the firstborn, the oldest son, protested against this, but they went ahead and they took Joseph and they took his coat off of him. They threw him in a pit, and then they saw some traders coming. And so it was Judah that said, let's don't kill him. Let's just sell him. We should be able to get a profit out of him. He'll be gone there, and we won't have to shed his blood. And so that's what they did. They sold him to these traders who were on their way to Egypt. And they took his coat, they dipped it in blood, animal blood, and they took it to his father Jacob and said, is this your son's coat? And so Jacob thought, and he thought for a long time, that Joseph was dead. And so in the meantime, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Chapter 38 kind of shifts gears, and it tells us about Judah during the time that Joseph was in Egypt. And it tells us that right after they sold Joseph to the traders, that he left and took a wife, a Canaanite wife, and she had 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And Judah arranged a marriage for with a woman named Tamar, and he was evil, and so God took his life before and Tamar had children. And in accordance with the custom of the day, then Judah arranged for his next son, Onan, to become Tamar's wife. Onan refused to do his duty by her and give her a child, and so God took his life as well. Shelah, the third son, was too young to marry at this point, so Judah told Tamar to go back to her father's house and wait. And when Shelah came of age, then he would arrange a marriage. But he never got around to it. And so the result of that was that Tamar took matters into her own hands and contrived a plot there, created a situation in which she became pregnant by Judah, her father-in-law. And then she confronted Judah with his hypocrisy and duplicity. And it's kind of a turning point in Judah's life because he acknowledged his failure. And he said, Tamar was more righteous than he was. The 2 sons, the twins that were born out of that relationship were Perez and Zerah. And the significant thing about that is that Perez would go on to become a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So once again, we see God using the most unlikely and flawed vessels to accomplish his purposes. And even though these 14 chapters that end Genesis are mostly about Joseph, we will continue to see a strong thread of Judah's life and influence in these chapters. This brings us up to chapter 39, and that's where our focal passage picks up, and our narrative resumes the story of Joseph then. So let's see what happened to Joseph. I'm going to read the first 10 verses. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after some time his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here my servant does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?" Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Joseph obviously landed on his feet in Egypt, having been bought by Potiphar, a high-ranking Egyptian official there. Potiphar is recorded as being the captain of the guard, more literally, I think, the captain of the executioners. So he's an high officer of Pharaoh. He supervised the wardens of the prisons in Egypt and was responsible for carrying out Pharaoh's sentences, including executions. And verse 2 kind of establishes the overall theme for the narrative in these verses. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. So that statement provides the theological basis for Joseph's success in his life. Joseph's circumstances changed from time to time, but the Lord's promises didn't change at all. God's purpose for Joseph's life would prevail in spite of efforts of different people to thwart that purpose. Verses 3 through 6 then relate that theme to the specific series of events that happened to Joseph here as he's sold into slavery in Egypt. Verse 4 tells us that Joseph was put in charge of Potiphar's household. It seems that his success occurred pretty rapidly. He became Potiphar's personal attendant, and then he was put in charge of the household. After this, his role expanded, and he was put in charge of the fields, and ultimately all that Potiphar owned. Joseph's success there was not just a reflection of his ability, but on the fact that the Lord was with him. And that had a far-reaching effect. Not only did God bless Joseph, but the Lord blessed Potiphar and his household because of Joseph's faithfulness. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph. That same pattern can hold true in our lives as well when we have a personal relationship with the Lord through faith in Jesus Christ, and we're faithful servants of His. That provides us opportunities to be a blessing to others. When that happens, people can see the Lord at work in our lives. Paul instructs in Colossians 3:23, "Whatever you do, do it heartily, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." Again, in Ephesians 6:6, Paul says, "Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart." with goodwill doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he's slave or free. So Joseph lived out that kind of lifestyle. He was well liked by the people in Potiphar's house, and in the pagan idol worshiping culture of Egypt, he was a testimony to the true and living God. So he was an honest and faithful worker, and the people he lived and worked with saw that. They got the message. Potiphar's trust in Joseph was so complete that Potiphar had no care except for his menu. Now you might wonder, was it unusual for foreign slaves like Joseph to be given so much authority? And what we see in Scripture is that if a foreign slave proved trustworthy over time, they could sometimes get great authority. Joseph's an example. Daniel is another example. He's another captive in the Old Testament who was given great responsibility by a foreign ruler. In both of those cases, they ultimately succeeded because they were faithful in cooperating with God's purpose. The very last sentence in verse 6 shifts the narrative here. And it tells us that Joseph was well built and handsome. The Bible doesn't often mention a character's physical traits, but here it describes Joseph's physical good looks and standing. The description similar to the description of David when Samuel, he was brought before Samuel by his father. He sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." Joseph's good looks attracted the attention of Potiphar's wife. And she was attracted to Joseph because he was handsome, perhaps because he was successful in managing her husband's household. So Joseph, we've seen, had suffered in the pit at the hand of his brothers because of their hatred. Now he's facing an even greater danger because of the lusts of an evil woman. Proverbs 23:27 says, "For a harlot is a deep pit, and a seductress is a narrow well." Scripture tells us that Joseph's loyalty to his master Potiphar prevents him from yielding to the advances of Potiphar's wife. And I imagine it took a great deal of courage and determination for Joseph to fight this battle day after day. But he succeeded in that. He explained to her why he wouldn't cooperate. She was another man's wife, and that man was his master. Joseph was trusted by his master and would not violate that trust. Even if nobody else found out about it, God would know and be displeased. So what she asked for was a moment of pleasure, but to Joseph this was a great wickedness against God. So his faith in God clearly influenced his moral stance. To commit adultery would involve sinning against God, as it tells us in verse 9. So Joseph does not exploit the trust that Potiphar placed in him, and he doesn't succumb to the temptation of sexual gratification. He recognized that all wrongdoing offends God. And we can kind of contrast what Joseph did with what David did years later. In Psalm 51:4, David laments after he's confronted by Nathan with his sin with Bathsheba. And David prays and says, against you and you only I have sinned and done this great evil in your sight. Against God. He recognized that after the fact. But here, Joseph understands that and does not succumb to the temptation. That attitude that Joseph had and that he articulates there is a sentiment that every part of Scripture agrees with there. Sin is ultimately a transgression against God. All sin is ultimately against God because all creation belongs to Him. Throughout the ancient world, adultery was called the great sin, and even before Moses and the law, it would have been considered the same by the Hebrews. Our lesson writer notes that Joseph didn't minimize the offense that he was tempted to commit, and neither should we. In calling sin what it is, we're better equipped to see the Lord as worthy of our obedience. As those who have believed the gospel and who have received mercy and grace from our God, we're well resourced to fight against sin in the ways that God has commanded, and we can be assured of His constant presence with us all along the way. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Andrew Murray was a South African pastor. He said nothing except the hidden, humble, constant fellowship with God can teach you as a child of God to hate sin as God wants you to hate it. Nothing but the constant nearness and unceasing power of the living Christ can make it possible for you to rightly understand what sin is and to detest it. So Joseph's example to us here in this situation provides a powerful example. Verse 10 tells us that even though he refused, that didn't end the temptation. It didn't deter the temptress. She continued to tempt him day after day. And that reminds us that our moral standards, our theological convictions, do not end temptation to violate our commitments. Very often we're tested day after day, as it's described here about Joseph. And it's all too easy to get worn down and give in. Joseph's example is a powerful reminder to us of the importance of standing firm. Ephesians 6:10 says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." Okay, our second point is picks up in verse 11, and I'm going to read all the way from 11 through verse 23. Now one day, Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. And she, Potiphar's wife, grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. And when he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." And she put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. And then she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me, but when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." And when his master heard the story his wife told him, "These are the things your slave did to me," he was furious. and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful. So, Potiphar's wife, some suggest, maybe orchestrated the events in verse 11 where the other servants were gone, were out of the way here, and she launched her attack here. And she caught him by his garment, and he squirmed out of it and fled, leaving her holding it. This is the second time that he's lost his coat or his outer garment here. And as William MacDonald in the Believer's Bible Commentary says, he lost his coat but saved his character and eventually gained a crown. She kept the coat as evidence that Joseph had attempted to assault her. Now, there are times in the Scripture when fleeing can be a mark of cowardice, but there are also times when it's evidence of courage and integrity. Joseph was wise enough to follow the advice that Paul would later give to Timothy. Flee the evil desires of youth, 2 Timothy 2:22. So throughout Scripture, believers are taught to flee fornication, idolatry, and youthful lust. Better to flee than to fail. Our lesson writer points out that when we're tempted toward sin, it's important that we don't linger in the presence of that temptation. We're to give our flesh no time to warm to the idea of disobedience. We're to flee without hesitation and with zero remorse for having done so. But even in the middle of temptation, we can believe that God's with us to protect us from being crushed by it and providing a way to escape it. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but will, with the temptation, make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." So, the story that she told first to the servants and then to Potiphar here is recorded for us in verses 13 through 18. And she really blames Potiphar for what happened, what she tells happened to her. My husband brought this Hebrew man to make fools of us. Some of your translations say to mock us. That term Hebrew is only used 4 times in the book of Genesis, and here it's a racial slur. The Egyptians, descendants of Ham, scorned the Hebrews, descendants of Shem, here. And one can imagine that these servants here in the household were probably envious of Joseph because of his success and the way that Potiphar appreciated him. That verb to mock or to make fools of suggests racial hatred here. And so when Potiphar came home, she told him the same story, and she used that same word, the Hebrew slave that you brought to us came to make a fool of me, to mock me. And then when I screamed for help, he left his garment and ran outside here. When Potiphar heard the story his wife told him, he was furious. And that anger of Potiphar is understandable and expected. And he had him thrown into prison. And specifically where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. Now, some have suggested that because he was thrown into the king's prison, and the description of the warden there that we see later on is the same description that we see of Potiphar in verse 1. So it's not clear if Potiphar still that person or if he's moved on, and this is another person that it's talking about here. But it seems unusual that he was put into this particular prison here. Several commentators posed the question, why didn't Potiphar simply have Joseph executed for this outrageous offense? And most of them suggest that because of his respect for Joseph, his integrity, and perhaps he knew what his wife was like, that he's reluctant to take that ultimate step of having Joseph executed. The Believer's Bible Commentary says the fact that Joseph was not executed may indicate that Potiphar didn't entirely believe his wife. He couldn't help knowing her true character. Is it possible? Another commentator says that Joseph had so impressed Potiphar that he found himself not fully believing the story his wife told. Is it possible that Potiphar determined to throw Joseph into the royal prison over which he had command in order to spare Joseph's life? In any case, we know that Joseph did wind up in prison. He wound up in prison for something that he didn't do. Psalms 105, a portion of that psalm talks about Joseph and this time, and says, they bruised his feet with shackles. His neck was put in irons. Now, the Genesis account doesn't mention any of those things, but it seems that perhaps Joseph was bound for a short time, but as we see, it wasn't long before the prison warden put him in charge of the other prisoners. And again, verse 21 tells us why that happened. The Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. Some of your translations may say mercy there. That word can be translated loyal love. So here in this Egyptian prison, Joseph experienced God's loyal love, and God faithfully kept his promise by staying with Joseph, even in these difficult circumstances. What's the evidence that the Lord was with him? He was rapidly promoted. He became the personal attendant of the royal cupbearer and baker. These men were not just in charge of the royal cellar and bakery, but they were advisors to the Pharaoh, and as we see later on in chapter 40, they had gotten crossways with the Pharaoh and they had been thrown into prison. But Joseph is assigned as their personal attendant. The warden put all prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. So quickly, after he's thrown into prison for something he didn't do, he becomes an important figure there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful. Now, we don't know what's going through Joseph's mind in all of this time, the highs and lows that he experienced, but we do know that God was with him. And Joseph's ongoing obedience reveals that he never lost hope in God's plan and purpose, even though his life path didn't seem to be headed on the path of blessing. But God's plan for Joseph was included in his plan for the Israelites. And God was orchestrating the big picture, and he was with Joseph every step of the way. That's where our lesson text ends, there with verse 23 in chapter 39. But this is our last lesson in Genesis here. Next week we'll have a lesson about Job's faith and trials, and then we'll pick up next quarter with Exodus. And so the events that happen in these last 11 chapters in Genesis are important. So we've seen Joseph become influential in Potiphar's household, become influential in prison, and in prison he continued. When the cupbearer and the baker were thrown into prison, they each had a dream, and they didn't have anyone to interpret it. And Joseph wound up interpreting the dreams for them, and as a result, the cupbearer was released. The baker was executed, and Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him, but the cupbearer forgot him for a couple of years. And then a couple of years after this happened, the Pharaoh had a couple of dreams, and no one could interpret them for him, and the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And he said, hey, there's a guy in prison here that can tell you what those dreams mean. And so Pharaoh called for Joseph to come, and so they brought him from the dungeon, and they cleaned him up, and he went to Pharaoh, and he explained those two dreams to Pharaoh. And the essence of those dreams was that there were going to be 7 years of very abundant harvest, and then there were going to be 7 years of terrible famine. And along with interpreting the dreams, Joseph told the Pharaoh what should be done, that they should put aside a significant portion of the produce in those good 7 years so that they would have food in the 7 years of famine. As a result of that, that pleased Pharaoh, and Pharaoh just said, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? And incidentally, that's the only time in Genesis that anyone is recorded as someone saying he has God's Spirit in him. And so Joseph was appointed to oversee this operation that he had suggested, and it was very successful. Joseph was given a new name. He was given a wife, and he had 2 sons. His oldest son, Manasseh, his name there was significant, meaning, if I can find it here, I have something on the order of God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. And then the second son was Ephraim. God has made me fruitful in the land of my afflictions. Starting in chapter 42, we see the events begin to unfold involving Jacob and the rest of his sons. The famine struck, and Genesis 42 details Joseph's brothers' first visit to Egypt. 10 of them came. Benjamin did not come. And Joseph recognized them, and it's interesting that right after he said he had Manasseh and he named him, God has made me forget all my father's household, they show up, and he recognizes them, but they don't recognize Joseph here. Chapter 43 through 45 detail the second visit of Jacob's family to Egypt. And this time, Benjamin comes, and Jacob's very reluctant to allow him to come. And when he comes, he's accused of malfeasance there, and Joseph is going to keep him there in Egypt as his servant. That's what the posture he takes with his brothers here. And very significantly, Judah is the one that very eloquently goes to bat for Benjamin and offers to take his place there. And so we see the transition of Judah from this hard-hearted person who has suggested selling Joseph to this brother who's willing to sacrifice his life for Benjamin here. In chapter 46, Jacob goes to Egypt after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers who he is. And so Jacob goes to Egypt here. This is the third and most decisive journey to Egypt. It's where Jacob left Canaan, the land of promise, for Egypt, the land of future slavery. So you might wonder, was this a mistake on his part? But very specifically, God told him in chapter 46, verses 3 and 4, go down to Egypt. And he's assured, I will go down with you, and I will surely bring you back again. So the stay in Egypt was to be temporary. It's a long temporary stay, but it's part of the divine purpose. Chapters 48 through 50 detail the last days of Jacob and Joseph. Jacob, when he's about to die, he asked to be buried in the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Leah are buried there. And so they took him back there and buried. When Jacob dies, the brothers are nervous. They wonder, was Joseph just being kind to us because Jacob was still around? And Joseph reassured them. He says, don't be afraid, for am I in the place of God? As far as you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about as it is this day, to save many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And so Joseph died there in Egypt at age 110. He made them promise to take his bones back to the promised land there. What do we take from this lesson? And there's an awful lot in those chapters. I would encourage you to read them there for yourself. That's just kind of a surface scan. We don't have any record of Joseph complaining about his circumstances from the moment the brothers sold him, through his journey to Egypt, his initial days in Potiphar's household. Instead, Joseph entrusted his situation to God's care. When we trust God in devastating circumstances, we're living by faith. Philippians 2:14 and 15 describes having such a humble attitude as shining like stars. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. When we trust that God's with us, in spite of our circumstances, we stand out from the crowd. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob repeatedly fell short of God's expectations. We've seen some of that as we've studied. But they continued to have faith in God. Joseph is a striking example of one who always responds in total trust and obedience to the will of God. That's the pattern, the example that Joseph gives us. That they may do righteousness and justice so that the Lord may fulfill what he has promised to Abraham. So the human part in the fulfillment of that promise was for people to respond like Joseph responded here. Then God will bless and they will prosper. In all the book of Genesis, only Joseph is described as that one who has the Spirit of God. The narrative is explicit in the emphasis on his total uprightness through the attempted seduction by Potiphar's wife. He was in jail because of the false witness brought against him. He's a good example of a believer who trusted God and made the best of his difficult circumstances. He never read what Jeremiah wrote to the exiles in Babylon. Jeremiah 29:7, and seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in its peace you will have peace. Peter wrote to the scattered Christians in the Roman Empire in 1 Peter 2:18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only in the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God and endure grief, suffering wrongfully. He put those instructions into practice. So God turned intended evil against Joseph into a good. God was with Joseph, prospered his way. Lying behind the course of events that we've studied about here is the lesson that all the Joseph narratives teach. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Joseph suffered for doing what's right, but God turned that evil into a blessing. What a powerful example for us. Like I say, come back next week and we will finish up this unit of study with a lesson about Job's faith. Thank you.